September 1st, 1715. The Palace of Versailles. The air in the king's bedchamber is a suffocating cocktail of incense, medicinal herbs, and the sweet, cloying stench of decay. It clings to the gold-leafed walls, the heavy velvet curtains, and the very skin of the courtiers who stand in horrified, silent vigil. Outside, the geometric perfection of Le Nôtre's gardens lies serene under a late summer sun, a universe of order and reason. But inside this room, chaos reigns. The source of the rot is the magnificent state bed, where a 76-year-old man, once the embodiment of divine radiance, is dying in excruciating slow motion. His leg, shrouded in bandages, is a blackened, gangrenous ruin, the infection crawling relentlessly up his body. This is the narrative of him, Louis XIV, the self-proclaimed Sun King, and his end is not a quiet fading of the light, but a grotesque, agonizing eclipse. The pain is a physical presence in the room, a searing torment that he endures with the last vestiges of the iron self-control that defined his life. He is a performer to the very end, his deathbed a final, terrible stage. The sounds are muted, the shuffling of feet, the stifled sobs of his secret wife, Madame de Maintenon, the desperate whispered prayers of the priests. But louder than all of this is the deafening silence of a world holding its breath. For 72 years, this one man has been the fixed point in the European cosmos, the sun around which all other planets and princes revolved. His will has redrawn maps, his armies have laid waste to provinces, his taste has defined an age. Now the sun is setting, and the sheer physicality of his decline, the smell of his own flesh putrefying, is a shocking, visceral refutation of the divine immortality he so carefully constructed. His final words, addressed to the weeping child who will become Louis XV, are not a boast, but a chilling confession. Do not imitate me in my taste for building, nor in my love of war. This was the saga of a man who became the sun, only to cast a shadow so vast it plunged his kingdom into twilight. How did the architect of France's absolute apogee, the master of its grand siècle, become the very author of its future ruin? To understand this man, we must return to the world that spawned him, a world of iron, blood, and existential uncertainty. The mid-17th century was not an age of gilded refinement, it was a charnel house. This is the saga of how one king's ambition burned so brightly it consumed the future of his own kingdom. The great bonfire of the 30 Years' War had only just been extinguished by the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the very year Louis ascended to the throne as a child. That conflict had been a 30-year-long nervous breakdown for the continent, a Boschian nightmare of famine, plague, and slaughter that had disemboweled the Holy Roman Empire, leaving a mosaic of weak, terrified German statelets in its place. The old hegemon, Habsburg Spain, the global superpower of the 16th century, was now a wheezing, arthritic giant, its veins of New World silver running dry, its armies exhausted, its pride mortally wounded by decades of unwinnable conflicts. Across the Channel, England was a cauldron of revolutionary chaos, a kingdom that had just committed the ultimate sacrilege of beheading its own king, consumed by the internal furies of civil war between Parliament and Crown. To the east, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was beginning its slow, agonizing slide into anarchy, while the Ottoman Empire, though still a fearsome power, was showing the first subtle signs of the sclerosis that would eventually cripple it. The world was a chessboard of exhausted players and vacant squares. It was a landscape of profound flux and instability, a geopolitical power vacuum. This was the world into which Louis XIV was born, a world where the old medieval order was dead, but the new order of nation-states was not yet fully formed. It was a moment of immense peril, but also of unparalleled opportunity for a nation with the will, the resources, and the ruthlessness to impose its vision upon the chaos. France, geographically blessed and demographically potent, was that nation. It stood at the center of this fractured continent, poised, ready. All it needed was a master, a will of iron to forge it from a kingdom into a weapon. The stage was set not just for a great reign, but for a revolution in the very nature of power, and the child king, traumatized and watching from the shadows, was learning the brutal lessons he would one day apply to a trembling Europe. To understand this man, we must return to the world that forged his very soul, a world not of palaces, but of terror and flight. The forging of this king's character took place not in the crucible of a battlefield, but in the cold, damp corridors of his own palaces during the nightmare years of the Fronde. This was a chaotic, often farcical, but deeply traumatic civil war that raged from 1648 to 1653. It was not a popular revolution, but a furious, selfish rebellion of the high nobility, the grands, princes of the blood who saw the regency of the child king, managed by his mother, Anne of Austria, and her cunning Italian minister, Cardinal Mazarin, as an opportunity to reclaim their feudal powers and dismantle the centralizing work of Cardinal Richelieu. For the young Louis, these were years of profound humiliation. The narrative is not one of princely education, but of a hunted animal. He and his mother were forced to flee Paris in the dead of night, the royal family becoming fugitives in their own kingdom. He experienced the penetrating chill of stone floors in unfamiliar castles, the gnawing anxiety of uncertainty, the acrid smell of fear that permeated the court. One infamous night, a Parisian mob, inflamed by the rebel princes, broke into the royal palace and stormed into his very bedchamber to ensure the king had not escaped again. He was forced to feign sleep while coarse, menacing faces stared down at him, their breath heavy with wine and contempt. This was the ultimate violation. The divine, sacred person of the king was being treated like a common prisoner, his sanctity profaned. This moment burned itself into his memory. It was here, in the crucible of fear and powerlessness, that the absolutist was born. He learned a series of indelible lessons, that the nobility, his own cousins and peers, were not loyal pillars of the crown, but ravenous wolves, ready to tear the state apart for their own gain. He learned that Paris was a fickle, dangerous beast that could never be trusted. And he learned the most important lesson of all. To survive, a king must not just be powerful, he must be unassailable. He must be remote, awe-inspiring, and absolute. The Fronde taught him that the only alternative to total control was total chaos. Every subsequent political decision of his 72-year reign would be a direct, calculated response to the terror of those formative years, an obsessive, lifelong project to ensure that no one, ever again, would break into the king's bedroom. The first tremor of the earthquake that would become his reign was felt on the 10th of March, 1661. Cardinal Mazarin, the brilliant, avaricious Italian who had been Louis's surrogate father and the true ruler of France for nearly 2 decades, finally succumbed to his illnesses. The day after his death, the 22-year-old king summoned the chief ministers of the realm to the council chamber. They arrived expecting business as usual, assuming the young, pleasure-loving monarch would simply appoint a new first minister to take Mazarin's place, allowing them to continue running the country as they always had. The air was thick with anticipation and the scent of old paper and beeswax from the polished floors. Louis, his face an impassive mask, let them assemble. He surveyed the powerful men, the secretaries of state, the chancellor, men who had wielded immense power in his name. Then, in a quiet, calm voice that cut through the silence like a shard of ice, he made an announcement that shattered their world. He informed them that from this day forward, he would be his own first minister. He forbade them to sign any document, no matter how trivial, without his express permission. He commanded them to report to him personally each day. When one of the aging, incredulous ministers asked, "To whom shall we now address ourselves for business?" the king's reply was swift and absolute. "To me." This was the moment the sun rose. It was a bloodless coup d'etat, executed with stunning precision. It was the public declaration of a secret he had been nursing since the dark days of the Fronde. The famous phrase later attributed to him, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state, may be apocryphal, but it perfectly captures the spirit of this revolutionary act. He was not merely claiming his birthright, he was fundamentally redefining the nature of French kingship. He was declaring that the state was not an abstract entity, not a collection of ancient offices and competing aristocratic interests. It was the personal, indivisible property of the monarch. The will of the king was now the law of the land, his ambition, the nation's destiny. The great nobles and seasoned ministers, who had viewed him as a handsome, dancing puppet, suddenly saw the glint of cold, hard steel. The boy they had underestimated was gone. In his place stood a master, ready to take the chaotic patchwork kingdom left to him by his ancestors and reforge it into a centralized, efficient, and terrible instrument of his personal will. The great game had begun. This obsessive drive for control was not merely a political calculation. It was a profound, psychological necessity, a secret demon born from the trauma of his youth. To understand this man, we must understand that his entire reign was a performance, the most elaborate and sustained piece of political theater ever staged. The inner motivation was not simply a lust for power in the conventional sense, but a desperate, lifelong quest to create an image of monarchy so perfect, so dazzling, and so absolute that it could never again be challenged or humiliated as it had been during the Fronde. He was not just a king, he was the lead actor, director, and producer in the grand opera of his own glory. His secret was the understanding that power was not just about armies and taxes, it was about belief. If he could make the world believe in his divine authority, then that authority would become real. This is why every detail of his life was ritualized and made public. The lever and the cauchère, the highly choreographed ceremonies of his waking and going to bed, were not private moments, but sacred rites, witnessed by dozens of the highest-ranking nobles. Who got to hand the king his shirt was a matter of immense political importance. He turned the aristocracy, those dangerous wolves of the Fronde, into glorified servants, forcing them to sublimate their ambitions for military glory into vicious competition for ceremonial trifles. He was neutralizing them through ritual. His every gesture, every word, every glance was calculated for effect. He cultivated an aura of impenetrable majesty, of divine remoteness. He rarely raised his voice, delivering devastating pronouncements in a calm, even tone that was far more terrifying than any royal rage. This relentless performance was a psychological armor against the memory of that shivering, powerless boy in the stormed bedchamber. By transforming his life into a constant, public spectacle of divine order, he was attempting to erase that foundational moment of chaos. The construction of his public persona as the Sun King, the radiant center of the universe, was therefore not an act of mere vanity. It was a deadly serious political strategy and a deep-seated psychological compulsion to impose an unbreakable order on a terrifyingly disorderly world. A performance of this magnitude required a vast fortune, and a king, no matter how absolute, cannot conjure gold from thin air. The fateful encounter that provided the financial engine for Louis's ambition was his alliance with Jean-Baptiste Colbert. This was not a relationship of equals, nor one of friendship, but a crucial partnership between a master with a limitless vision and a servant of relentless, obsessive genius. Colbert was the son of a provincial merchant, a man of bourgeois stock, with ink in his veins and an accountant's soul. He was the antithesis of the flamboyant, swashbuckling aristocracy. He was a creature of the office, a man who lived and breathed numbers, memoranda, and regulations. He had been trained in the service of Cardinal Mazarin, managing the cardinal's colossal and often illicitly acquired personal fortune with ruthless efficiency. When Mazarin died, he bequeathed his brilliant protégé to the king with the advice, "Sire, I owe you everything, but I believe I am acquitting myself of some of that debt in giving you Colbert." It was the most valuable inheritance Louis would ever receive. From 1661 until his death in 1683, Colbert served as the Controller General of Finances, and his role was nothing less than to monetize the king's glory. He was the architect of French mercantilism, a doctrine that viewed the world economy as a zero-sum game of finite wealth. The goal was to make France rich by making its rivals poor. Colbert worked with a terrifying, inhuman energy. He reformed the chaotic tax system, cracked down on corruption, and streamlined collection, dramatically increasing the crown's revenue. He subsidized domestic industries, creating state-sponsored manufactories for everything from tapestries at Gobelins to mirrors at Saint-Gobain, aiming to make France economically self-sufficient and an exporter of luxury goods that would drain gold and silver from other nations. He established trading companies for the Indies, built canals like the Canal du Midi to unite the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and crucially, he began the construction of a powerful, modern French navy, understanding that economic power and military power were two sides of the same coin. He was the ultimate servant of the absolutist state, a man who saw France as a great business to be managed for the profit of its CEO, the king. Without Colbert's grinding, joyless, brilliant administrative labor, the armies, the palaces, and the wars of the Sun King would have been utterly impossible. He was the indispensable, unglamorous bookkeeper of the Grand Siècle. The first, and most brutal, demonstration of the new order came just 6 months after Louis took personal control. The target was Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finances, the most powerful and ostentatiously wealthy man in France. This is a scene about the price of power. Fouquet was everything the young Louis was not, and everything he feared. Brilliant, charming, and impossibly rich, he had amassed a colossal fortune through a combination of financial genius and spectacular corruption. His personal emblem was a squirrel, with the motto, "Quo non ascende," to what heights will he not climb? The climax of his hubris was a party he threw for the king in August of 1661 at his newly completed chateau, Vaux-le-Vicomte. The scene was a sensory assault of unprecedented luxury. Thousands of guests were entertained in gardens so magnificent they would become the template for Versailles. The finest food, the most exquisite music by Lully, a new play by Molière. It was a festival of splendors that utterly eclipsed any royal residence. The air was thick with the scent of 10,000 flowers and expensive perfume, the night sky illuminated by a fireworks display that turned the darkness to day. But as Louis walked through the gilded halls, past the marble statues and cascading fountains, he was not filled with admiration. He was filled with a cold, silent fury. The sensory overload of Vaux was not a tribute, it was a challenge. Fouquet was not honoring his king. He was demonstrating that a mere subject could outshine the sun itself. This was the sin Louis could not forgive. It was a personal echo of the Fronde, a display of aristocratic arrogance and power that threatened his own supremacy. He saw in Fouquet's magnificence the ghost of the rebel princes. 3 weeks later, the trap was sprung. The king, feigning friendship, was attended by Fouquet at a council meeting. As the superintendent left, he was arrested by D'Artagnan, the captain of the king's musketeers. What followed was a 17-year show trial, a legal monstrosity orchestrated by Colbert, Fouquet's rival. Fouquet was accused of embezzlement, his vast network of credit and patronage systematically dismantled. He was condemned to lifelong imprisonment, his name erased, his beautiful chateau stripped bare. The fall of Fouquet was a calculated act of political terrorism. It sent a shockwave of fear through the French elite. The message was brutally clear. There is only one sun in this sky. All wealth, all power, all glory emanates from the king alone. Anyone who dares to build their own source of light will be extinguished. With the domestic wolves tamed, the Sun King turned his gaze outward, seeking a worthy antagonist on the grand European stage. He found it not in a rival monarchy, but in a strange and infuriating anomaly, the United Provinces of the Netherlands. The Dutch Republic was the ideological and economic antithesis of everything Louis XIV represented, a macro-level adversary whose very existence was an affront to his vision of a divinely ordered world. Where Louis's France was a pyramid of hierarchical, Catholic, absolutist power, the Netherlands was a messy, decentralized federation of Protestant merchants. It was a republic in an age of kings, a nation governed not by the sword-wielding nobility, but by dour, black-clad burghers who thought in terms of profit margins and shipping lanes. The source of their power was not land or lineage, but water and trade. Their global maritime empire, built on the revolutionary finance of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange and the unparalleled efficiency of their merchant fleet, the famous Floits, had made this tiny, waterlogged scrap of land the wealthiest state in Europe. They were the continent's bankers, shippers, and middlemen. French wine reached the Baltic in Dutch ships. Swedish timber reached Spain in Dutch ships. This economic dominance was a direct threat to Colbert's mercantilist strategy. The Dutch were draining the world of the gold that Louis believed was rightfully his. But the conflict was deeper than mere economics. It was a clash of civilizations. In the Dutch, Louis saw a nation of heretics, regicides. They had harbored English parliamentarians and republicans, a triple insult to his identity as the most Christian king. Their culture celebrated bourgeois sobriety, religious tolerance, and individual enterprise, values that were poison to his ideal of a unified state, demanding absolute obedience in both politics and faith. Their success suggested a viable alternative model of modernity, one not based on a sun king and his court. For Louis, the Dutch Republic was not just a rival to be defeated, it was a heresy to be eradicated. Their destruction was a geopolitical necessity, an economic imperative, and a sacred duty. The impending war would be more than a contest for territory. It would be a crusade against a modernity he could not comprehend and would not tolerate. The collision, when it came in 1672, was swift and devastating, a scene of shocking triumph that quickly curdled into a long, bitter lesson in the limits of power. This was Louis's first fatal mistake, a psychological breaking point born of pure hubris. The French invasion, meticulously planned and lavishly funded, was a masterpiece of military logistics. A force of over 120,000 men, The largest and best-equipped army in Europe poured over the Dutch border in a torrent of steel and fire. The initial campaign was a stunning success. Fortress after fortress, city after city, fell to the French onslaught. The Dutch field army was brushed aside, the Republic's creaky political machinery seized with panic. It seemed that the heretical nation of shopkeepers was about to be wiped from the map. Louis traveled with his army, basking in the glow of easy victories, his court poets and painters working furiously to immortalize his gloire. But then, the Dutch did something desperate, something unimaginable to the French mindset. With the enemy army just miles from Amsterdam, they chose to destroy their own country to save it. They opened the great sea dikes. The sensory experience was apocalyptic. Not the roar of cannons, but the gurgling, hissing, and then thundering roar of the North Sea, deliberately unleashed upon their own fields, their own villages, their own homes. The landscape was transformed in a matter of hours from verdant pasture land into a vast, shallow, brackish sea. The acrid smell of salt water filled the air. The French army, a magnificent instrument of land warfare, found itself suddenly stranded, its advance halted by a muddy, impassable expanse of water. The Dutch waterline, a man-made catastrophe, had stopped the Sun King dead in his tracks. For Louis, this was a profound psychological shock. He had calculated troop strengths, siegecraft, and dynastic politics. He had not calculated a nation's willingness to commit suicide to defy him. The war bogged down into a grinding, ruinously expensive stalemate. The quick, glorious victory he had anticipated dissolved into a long, frustrating war of attrition that drained his treasury and galvanized a coalition of enemies against him. He had learned that the will of a people could be a more formidable defense than the strongest fortress, a bitter lesson that tempered his arrogance, but also hardened his resolve, planting the seeds of a lifelong, obsessive vendetta against his new nemesis, William of Orange, the man who had orchestrated this defiance. Frustrated abroad, Louis intensified his project of control at home, turning to an even more ambitious and insidious weapon: architecture and etiquette. The chaos of the Fronde had taught him to distrust Paris. The frustrating stalemate of the Dutch war taught him the need for an unassailable center of power. His solution was Versailles, the ultimate instrument of political control, a scene of opportunity seized from chaos. What began as a modest hunting lodge belonging to his father was transformed over decades of relentless construction into the largest, most magnificent palace on earth. Versailles was not merely a royal residence, it was a political statement and a gilded cage. The sensory assault began with its sheer scale, the endless golden facade, the hall of mirrors with its 17 towering arches, reflecting the light from 17 matching windows overlooking the gardens, the geometric perfection of the vast grounds. It was all designed to overwhelm, to awe, and to intimidate. It was a man-made universe, a landscape of perfect, rational order imposed upon nature, mirroring the political order the king was imposing upon France. The brilliance of the strategy lay in how he used this magnificent stage. He systematically uprooted the great nobles, the descendants of the feudal lords who had terrorized his childhood, from their regional power bases. He made it clear that true power, favor, and wealth could only be found in one place, at his side. He lured them to Versailles and trapped them in a web of ritual and surveillance. The air in the palace was thick with perfume, intrigue, and relentless psychological pressure. Life became a permanent, exhausting performance, a vicious competition for proximity to the royal sun. A noble's entire career could be made or ruined by a royal glance, a whispered word, the right to hold a candle during the king's coucher. He transformed these powerful, dangerous men into domesticated peacocks, preening and squabbling over trivialities, while he and his bourgeois ministers, like Colbert, ran the actual machinery of the state. Versailles was the ultimate victory over the Fronde. By creating a world where etiquette was strategy and ceremony was power, Louis neutered the French aristocracy more effectively than any army ever could. He had them imprisoned not by iron chains, but by golden ones of their own making. By the early 1680s, the machine was working to perfection. This was the moment of greatest triumph, the absolute zenith of the Sun King's reign and of French power in Europe. The Treaty of Nijmegen in 1678 had ended the long Dutch War on terms highly favorable to France, solidifying its borders and confirming its status as the continent's supreme military and political arbiter. The climax of Act II had arrived. France was now, without question, the hegemon of the Western world. The sensory experience of this period was one of overwhelming cultural power. The French language replaced Latin as the international language of diplomacy, culture, and science. A German princeling or a Russian aristocrat felt unsophisticated if they could not converse fluently in the language of Molière and Racine. French fashion, French food, French architecture, and French art set the standard for every court in Europe. To be civilized was to be French. The French army, reformed by Le Tellier and his son Louvois, was a terrifyingly efficient instrument of state policy, its numbers and professionalism unmatched. The fortresses being constructed along the nation's frontiers by the brilliant engineer Vauban, a chain of interlocking defenses known as the Pré Carré, or square field, were making France into an impregnable citadel. At the center of it all was Louis, no longer just a king, but a living demigod. His official portraits depicted him as a Roman emperor or Apollo, the god of the sun. Medals were struck commemorating his every achievement. Panegyrics were written. Statues were erected. The adulation was relentless and absolute. The state itself was now a vast, centralized bureaucracy, its tendrils reaching into every corner of the kingdom, all reporting back to the king and his councils at Versailles. For a brief, shining moment, the vision was complete. The chaos of the Fronde was a distant memory. The humiliations of the past were buried under an avalanche of gold, marble, and military glory. Louis had achieved what he had set out to do. He had imposed a perfect, rational, and absolute order upon his kingdom, and through his kingdom, upon Europe itself. The sun was at its highest point in the sky, casting a brilliant, dazzling light across the continent. At the summit of his power, the psychology of triumph began a subtle, poisonous work on the king's mind. This was the moment of hubris, the point at which the man began to fuse completely with the divine image he had so carefully constructed. He truly began to believe in his own propaganda. The motto he adopted, nec pluribus impar, literally, not unequal to many, captured this burgeoning sense of unique world historical destiny. It implied he was capable of taking on all his enemies at once, a match for the entire world. He was no longer just the King of France. He saw himself as the arbiter of Christendom, the secular arm of God's will on earth. This fusion of personal ego and divine mission is crucial to understanding the catastrophic errors that would follow. He started to view any opposition not as a legitimate difference in geopolitical interest, but as a personal insult and a form of blasphemy. To resist the will of Louis was to resist the will of God himself. The checks and balances that might have constrained another monarch were gone. Mazarin was long dead. Colbert, who had often dared to caution the king about the ruinous cost of his wars, died in 1683, and Louis replaced him with more pliable ministers who would not question the pursuit of gloire. He was now surrounded only by mirrors, the glittering surfaces of Versailles reflecting back his own majesty, the sycophantic praise of his courtiers confirming his own infallibility. The man who had once been so shrewd and calculating, so attuned to the nuances of power, was beginning to lose his grip on reality. He was isolated within the perfect machine he had built, insulated from the gritty, unpleasant truths of a kingdom groaning under the weight of his ambitions. The immense success of his early and middle reign had taught him a dangerous lesson: that his will was irresistible, his judgment flawless. This psychological state, this divinization of the self, was the precondition for the two great disasters that would define the second half of his reign: a catastrophic act of religious intolerance at home and a relentless series of ever-expanding wars abroad. The sun, in its brilliance, was becoming blind to the shadows it was casting. Every great drama needs a great antagonist, and for the Sun King, that figure was William of Orange. This was the sworn enemy, a man who seemed to have been created by fate for the express purpose of thwarting Louis's ambitions. Their rivalry was not just a political contest. It was a deeply personal, obsessive struggle between two utterly antithetical personalities and worldviews, a close-up of the clash between absolutism and its alternative. William was everything Louis was not. Where Louis was tall, handsome, and charismatic, William was small, frail, asthmatic, and hunchbacked. Where Louis cultivated an aura of effortless majesty and divine radiance, William was cold, taciturn, and deeply private, a man who inspired respect but rarely affection. Yet within this fragile frame burned an icy, unquenchable fire. He was a man possessed by a single, all-consuming purpose: to stop the expansion of French power, which he saw as a mortal threat to the liberties of Europe and the Protestant faith. His personal history fueled this obsession. The House of Orange had been the traditional leaders of the Dutch Republic, but he had come of age during a period when the office of stadtholder was left vacant by the powerful merchant oligarchs who feared his monarchical ambitions. It was Louis's invasion in 1672 that had propelled William to power, when the terrified Dutch people turned to him as their only savior. He never forgot that it was Louis's aggression that had been the catalyst for his own rise. He was a master of the new world of finance and diplomacy that Louis, with his feudal mindset of glory and conquest, never fully grasped. William understood that wars were won not just on the battlefield, but on the exchanges of Amsterdam and London. He became the master coalition builder, the patient, indefatigable spider at the center of a vast diplomatic web, tirelessly weaving together alliances of disparate states: Spain, Austria, England, Sweden, the German principalities, all united by their shared fear of the French juggernaut. For decades, the history of Europe was the story of this personal duel: Louis's relentless thrust for universal monarchy and William's dogged, brilliantly orchestrated resistance. It was a contest between the sun and the shade, a clash that would drain the treasuries of both nations and leave a continent scarred by war. While the great game of war and diplomacy played out on the macro level, the king was also engaged in a revolutionary project of state-building at home. His reforms were not aimed at the welfare of his subjects, but at making the state a more efficient instrument for the projection of his power. This was the construction of the great machine. At the heart of this was a massive legal and administrative centralization. The Code Louis was a series of legal ordinances that sought to standardize the bewildering patchwork of regional laws and customs that had characterized medieval France. For the first time, the kingdom began to have a unified legal framework, imposed from the center. This was a direct assault on the traditional powers of the regional parlement, high courts, and local aristocracies. He expanded the system of intendants, royal officials dispatched to the provinces with broad powers over justice, finance, and police. These men were the king's eyes and ears, his loyal agents, almost always chosen from the non-noble classes, who owed their entire careers to him. They systematically usurped the authority of the hereditary provincial governors, who were safely neutralized at Versailles. This administrative revolution was paired with Colbert's economic machine building. Mercantilism was the state's ideology, treating national wealth as a weapon of war. Colbert's regulations touched every aspect of the economy, specifying the quality and dimensions of manufactured goods, all aimed at boosting exports and starving rivals of French gold. The founding of the French academies, of sciences, of architecture, of music, was another tool of centralization, standardizing French culture and harnessing the nation's intellectual and artistic genius to the service of the crown. The France that emerged from this period was a new kind of political entity. It was a modern, bureaucratic state, a vast, complex, and hierarchical machine designed for a single purpose: to extract the maximum amount of money and manpower from the population and channel it toward the king's two great passions: building and war. It was a marvel of efficiency, but it was also a cold, impersonal, and oppressive structure, a machine that would eventually begin to grind down the very people it was supposed to serve. Within the gilded, formal world of Versailles, a hidden current of power flowed through the king's bedchamber. The influence of women, his mother, his wife, and his series of powerful mistresses, formed the crucial, often overlooked context of his reign. These were the onions and vegetables, the personal relationships that subtly shaped the psychology and even the policy of the absolute monarch. His mother, Anne of Austria, had been his regent and his shield during the Fronde. Their bond was exceptionally close, and it was from her, a Spanish Habsburg princess, that he inherited his profound sense of royal dignity and his staunch Catholic piety. His official wife, the Spanish Infanta Maria Teresa, was a quiet, unassuming figure, a pawn in the game of dynastic politics, whose primary role was to produce an heir. Her political influence was negligible, but her Spanish heritage provided the pretext for some of Louis's most aggressive wars of expansion. The real power lay with his maîtresses en titre, his official mistresses. In the first half of the reign, this role was dominated by the brilliant and beautiful Marquise de Montespan. She was the Queen of Versailles in all but name, a lavish patron of the arts, and the mother of several of Louis's legitimized children. The era of Montespan coincided with the most glorious, triumphant, and secular period of the reign. But as Louis aged, he fell under the influence of a very different woman, Françoise d'Aubigné, the Marquise de Maintenon. She had been the governess to his illegitimate children, a woman of sharp intellect, humble origins, and intense, sober piety. After the death of Queen Maria Theresa, Louis secretly married her in 1683. The flamboyant, sun-drenched court of Montespan gave way to the devout, somber atmosphere of Maintenon. Her influence was immense and coincided with a dramatic shift in the king's personality and policies. He became more devout, more intolerant, more convinced of his role as the defender of the Catholic faith. While it is too simple to blame her directly, her rise to power coincided precisely with the most disastrous decision of his reign. The whispers in the king's apartment, the transition from the bed of a worldly sensualist to that of a pious governess, had consequences that would echo across all of Europe. The first great crack in the edifice of the Sun King's power was a self-inflicted wound, an act of monumental folly, driven by religious zeal and the psychology of absolute power. In 1685, Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes. This was a harbinger of the storm to come. The original edict, signed by his grandfather Henry IV in 1598, had been a landmark of religious toleration, granting France's Protestant minority, the Huguenots, substantial rights and freedoms. It had ended decades of savage religious civil wars and had, for nearly a century, allowed the two faiths to coexist. But to Louis, steeped in the ideal of un roi, une loi, une foi, one king, one law, one faith, the continued existence of this large, prosperous, and independent-minded Protestant community was an intolerable stain on the perfect unity of his kingdom. It was a challenge to his absolute authority. Egged on by his more zealous Catholic advisers and the pious Madame de Maintenon, he unleashed a policy of brutal persecution, the dragonnades, quartering abusive soldiers in Huguenot homes to terrorize them into converting. The final act was the Edict of Fontainebleau, which declared Protestantism illegal in France. Churches were demolished, pastors were exiled, and all Protestant worship was forbidden. Louis and his court celebrated this as a great victory for the faith, a pious act that had restored the religious unity of France. But it was a catastrophic miscalculation. He believed the Huguenots, deprived of their leaders, would quickly convert. Instead, between 200,000 and 300,000 of them chose to flee. This was not a random migration. It was a mass exodus of some of France's most skilled, educated, and industrious citizens. They were artisans, merchants, bankers, sailors, and intellectuals. They took their skills, their capital, and their bitter hatred of the Sun King with them. They settled in the lands of his enemies, in the Netherlands, in England, in Prussia, where they became a vital engine for the economic and military development of the very powers that were coalescing against France. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes was a gift to his antagonists. It was an act of ideological purification that bled his own kingdom of talent and strengthened his foes, all for the sake of an abstract unity that existed only in the king's mind. The arrogance that led Louis to revoke the Edict of Nantes soon spilled over into his foreign policy, leading to the fateful act that would plunge Europe into a quarter-century of nearly continuous warfare. The psychological error was his profound underestimation of his enemy's resolve. The trigger was the French invasion of the Palatinate in 1688. This was an act of aggression driven by a dubious dynastic claim, a transparent pretext for seizing more territory along the Rhine and intimidating the German princes into submission. The invasion itself was conducted with shocking brutality, with French armies systematically burning and leveling entire cities like Heidelberg and Speyer. Louis and his war minister, Louvois, believed this policy of calculated terror would shock the German states into submission and prevent the formation of a hostile coalition. They were catastrophically wrong. This rape of the Palatinate did the opposite. It galvanized a wave of anti-French fury across Germany and all of Protestant Europe. The sensory image was that of smoke-blackened ruins and streams of desperate refugees, powerful propaganda for Louis's enemies. More importantly, Louis had misjudged the political situation in England. He launched his invasion, believing that his great rival, William of Orange, was bogged down in a risky attempt to seize the English throne from the Catholic king, James II. Louis calculated that England would be paralyzed by a protracted civil war, leaving him free to work his will in Germany. But William's glorious revolution was swift and almost bloodless. He and his wife Mary were crowned co-monarchs of England. Suddenly, William of Orange, the implacable stadtholder of the Netherlands, was also King of England, able to command the combined naval and financial power of the two greatest maritime nations in the world. The invasion of the Palatinate, intended as a quick, intimidating strike, had instead acted as the final catalyst, cementing the Grand Alliance against him. William had finally united almost all of Europe, England, the Netherlands, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, Savoy, into a formidable coalition dedicated to one purpose: containing the Sun King. The 9 Years' War had begun, a conflict that would stretch French resources to the breaking point and mark the beginning of the end of its unchallenged supremacy. The 9 Years' War ended in a stalemate in 1697, but it was merely the prelude to the greatest catastrophe of the reign, the War of the Spanish Succession. This was the epic final act of the long struggle between Louis and the rest of Europe, a brutal 13-year conflict that would shatter the myth of French invincibility and bleed the kingdom white. The crisis was triggered in 1700 by the death of the childless King Charles II of Spain. His vast empire, Spain, its Italian possessions, the Spanish Netherlands, and its colossal territories in the Americas, was the greatest prize in Europe. In his will, Charles left his entire inheritance to Louis's grandson, Philip, Duke of Anjou. It was a staggering diplomatic victory for Louis. Accepting the will would mean creating a Bourbon superstate that would dominate the continent, but it would also guarantee a massive war with the Grand Alliance, now led by England and the Holy Roman Empire. Refusing it would mean ceding the prize to the Austrian Habsburgs, his dynastic rivals. In a moment of supreme arrogance, Louis accepted the will, proclaiming, "There are no more Pyrenees." The war that followed was a global conflict, with battles raging from the plains of Flanders to the mountains of Italy and the waters of the Caribbean. But for France, it was an unmitigated disaster. The French army, once the terror of Europe, suffered a series of shattering defeats at the hands of the brilliant Allied commanders, the Duke of Marlborough for England and Prince Eugene of Savoy for Austria. The Battle of Blenheim in 1704 was a thunderclap, the first major defeat a French army had suffered in open field in over 50 years. It was followed by the crushing losses at Ramillies in 1706 and Oudenarde in 1708. The sensory experience of these battles was a hellish forge of industrial-scale slaughter, with tens of thousands of men dying in a single day amidst the roar of cannons, the crackle of disciplined musket fire, and the screams of the wounded. The myth of French invincibility was annihilated. The aura of the Sun King, the image of the invincible warrior god, was shattered. The war dragged on, a relentless meat grinder that consumed an entire generation of Frenchmen and pushed the state to the very brink of utter collapse. The military catastrophes were compounded by a disaster of biblical proportions at home. This was the collapse, the moment when the kingdom itself seemed to be dying alongside its armies. The winter of 1709 was not merely a cold spell, it was a climatic anomaly, a Siberian deep freeze that descended upon Europe. The Great Frost, as it became known, was a sensory apocalypse of absolute cold. The temperature plummeted and stayed there for weeks. Rivers froze solid. The ground hardened to the consistency of iron. Trees split open from the cold. The air itself seemed brittle, the silence of the snow-covered landscape broken only by the crackle of splitting logs. For France, a primarily agrarian society, the consequences were devastating. The winter wheat crop was completely destroyed. Fruit trees and vineyards, the source of much of the nation's wealth, were killed off. When a brief thaw was followed by another deep freeze, the disaster was complete. The ensuing famine was one of the worst in French history. Starving, desperate people roamed the countryside, eating roots, grass, and the bark from trees. The stench of death hung over villages where the population was wiped out by hunger and disease. By some estimates, between 600,000 and 1 million people perished. And all the while, the state, crippled by the war, could offer no relief. The treasury was empty. The nation was bankrupt. In a desperate symbolic act, Louis, the man who had built Versailles, was forced to send his own solid silver furniture, the magnificent creations of his court artists, to the mint, to be melted down into coins to pay his starving, defeated soldiers. It was the ultimate humiliation. The Sun King, the master of Europe's most opulent court, was reduced to melting his throne to buy bread for his army. The kingdom was on its knees, demographically shattered, financially ruined, and psychologically broken. The glory of the Grand Siècle had frozen to death in the snows of 1709. And so we return to the final scene, the deathbed in Versailles. But now we see it with the full weight of this history. The hero's finale was not a quiet sunset, but a final, agonizing act of endurance, a bookend to a life of relentless performance. The gangrene consuming his leg was a physical metaphor for the rot that had set into his kingdom. The bankruptcy, the exhaustion, the demographic devastation. The unbearable pain he suffered in his final weeks, which he bore with a stoicism that astonished his physicians and courtiers, was a microcosm of the suffering his kingdom had endured during the long, dark years of the last war. He was a man confronting the utter ruin of his life's work. The armies he had built had been shattered. The treasury he had filled was empty. The people whose adoration he had craved were starving and miserable. His own family had been decimated by disease. His son, the Grand Dauphin, and his eldest grandson had all died within a year, leaving a frail great-grandson as his heir. The Palace of Versailles, once a vibrant theater of his glory, was now a silent, gloomy mausoleum haunted by ghosts and the specter of defeat. Yet, even in this final collapse, the force of his will remained. He continued to meet with his ministers, to dictate orders, to perform the duties of kingship from his bed of agony. His final words to the future Louis XV, "My child, you are going to be a great king. Do not imitate me in my taste for building, nor in my love of war. Try, on the contrary, to be at peace with your neighbors. Try to relieve your people, which I have been so unfortunate as not to be able to do," were a stunning, tragic admission of failure. It was the verdict of the man himself on his own reign. He understood, at the very end, the precise nature of his fatal flaw. The two pillars of his glory, Versailles and war, had been the very instruments that had burned his kingdom. His final moments were a quiet, desperate warning, an attempt to exorcise the demon of gloire that had possessed him and his nation for over half a century. And as he finally expired, the great clock of the state he had built, the machine he had perfected, kept ticking. But its master, its sun, was gone, leaving behind a chilling, uncertain twilight. The legacy of Louis XIV is a profound conflict of interpretations, a historical battleground where he is simultaneously celebrated as the architect of modern France and condemned as a vainglorious tyrant. How a nation evaluates this man depends entirely on what it chooses to see. For those who see the greatness of the state as the ultimate measure, he is a figure of unparalleled genius. They point to the France he inherited, a fractured, semi-feudal kingdom plagued by rebellious nobles, and the France he left behind, a centralized, modern, bureaucratic state with clear, defensible borders. They see the man who tamed the aristocracy, who rationalized the legal system, who built a world-class navy from nothing, and who made France the undisputed arbiter of European culture. They walk through the halls of Versailles, admire the paintings of Lebrun, listen to the music of Lully, and see the Grand Siècle, a golden age of art and power made possible by the vision and patronage of one man. In this interpretation, the wars, the taxes, the famines are the tragic but necessary costs of forging a great nation, the labor pains of modernity. But there is another, darker interpretation. In this view, Louis XIV is the very embodiment of royal hubris, a megalomaniac whose insatiable ego plunged Europe into decades of needless war. His critics see the immense suffering of the common people, taxed into oblivion to pay for palaces and campaigns. They see the hundreds of thousands of talented Huguenots driven into exile by his religious bigotry, a self-inflicted wound from which the French economy never fully recovered. They see a foreign policy of relentless bullying aggression that ultimately united the entire continent against France and shattered its supremacy. They argue that the absolutist state he perfected, while efficient at waging war, was also brittle and oppressive, a system that stifled dissent, discouraged economic innovation, and concentrated so much power in one man that it created a vacuum upon his death. For these critics, the Sun King's reign was not a golden age, but a glittering facade that concealed a foundation of debt, misery, and intolerance. A magnificent but unsustainable performance that laid the essential groundwork for the bankruptcy and systemic crisis that would, 80 years later, explode into the French Revolution. So, how did the sun shine so brightly it burned its own kingdom? The final comprehensive answer to this paradox lies in the fatal fusion of the king's personal glory with the interests of the state. Louis XIV's fundamental error was that he came to believe, absolutely and without question, that there was no difference between the two. L'État, c'est moi, was not just a political slogan, it became his psychological reality. This solved the paradox. The very tools he used to achieve his initial, stunning successes became the instruments of his ultimate failure. Versailles, his masterpiece of political control, was the perfect example. It succeeded in domesticating the nobility, but it also created an artificial, hermetically sealed world that insulated the king from the realities of his own country. Surrounded by fawning courtiers in a universe of ritual, he lost the ability to gauge the true mood of his people or the limits of their endurance. The man who had once been a shrewd political realist became a prisoner in his own golden cage, believing the flattering reflections he saw in the Hall of Mirrors. Similarly, his relentless pursuit of gloire through warfare was at first a rational strategy to secure France's borders and establish its primacy. But over time, the wars ceased to be about national interest and became about the king's personal reputation and dynastic pride. The War of the Spanish Succession was not a war for the security of France. It was a war for the glory of the House of Bourbon. He could not compromise, could not accept a negotiated peace that might tarnish his image, and so he bled his country for a decade to preserve his own sense of honor. The centralized state he built was a magnificent tool for mobilizing resources for his wars, but it was too rigid, too dependent on the will of one man. He created a system that only he could operate, failing to cultivate the institutions or the statesmen who could manage it after his death. In the end, the sun burned the kingdom because it allowed no other sources of light. By concentrating all power, all glory, and all initiative in himself, he created a state that was brilliant, dazzling, but ultimately hollow, a magnificent shell that began to crumble the moment its creator was gone. The verdict of history on Louis XIV is a profound and timeless lesson on the seductive poison of absolutism. His life is the ultimate cautionary tale about the deep-seated human desire to impose a perfect, rational, and permanent order on a chaotic world, and the catastrophic consequences that often follow. He represents the peak of what can be achieved by a single, focused, and indomitable human will. He demonstrated that it is possible to tame an aristocracy, to build a centralized state, to dominate a continent's culture, and to project military power on an unprecedented scale. He forged France. But his reign is also a testament to the fact that such a system, built around the cult of a single man, is inherently brittle and corrupting. The corruption is not necessarily one of money, but one of the soul. Absolute power, as his story shows, creates an echo chamber. It eliminates dissent, banishes unpleasant truths, and ultimately blinds the ruler to the consequences of his own actions. The pursuit of a perfect, unified order, one king, one law, one faith, led directly to the intolerance of the revocation and the brutal aggression of his wars. The very quest for absolute security and permanence led to a state of perpetual conflict and, eventually, profound insecurity and exhaustion. His story teaches us that a state's true strength lies not in the brilliance of a single ruler, but in the resilience of its institutions, the diversity of its people, and its capacity for adaptation and change. All things his rigid system was designed to suppress. The France he built was like a magnificent, perfectly crafted clockwork machine, beautiful to behold, but incapable of evolving. When the world changed around it, when new economic and political ideas began to emerge, it could only continue to tick along its preordained path, a path that led, inexorably, toward the abyss of 1789. The final frame, the image that remains long after the story is told, is the Palace of Versailles itself, seen at dawn. The first rays of the morning sun strike the golden gates and the vast, cold facade, making it shimmer with an almost supernatural beauty. It stands as a monument to a singular, monumental ambition, a testament to the power of a human being to impose his dreams upon stone and earth. But there is no warmth in this light. The palace is a masterpiece, but it is also a mausoleum. It is a symbol of unparalleled glory that feels cold to the touch. As we glide through the Hall of Mirrors, we see not the throngs of courtiers, but a vast, shimmering emptiness. The silence is absolute, broken only by the echo of our own footsteps on the parquet floors. The gardens outside are perfectly manicured, a triumph of reason over nature, but they are also sterile, lifeless. This is the delicious kebab, the aftertaste of the saga. Versailles is the perfect metaphor for the reign of the Sun King. It is an artifact of breathtaking splendor, built on a foundation of national bankruptcy and popular suffering. It is a gilded cage that imprisoned not only the nobility, but the king himself, cutting him off from the nation he ruled. Its long, empty corridors seem to echo with the ghosts of a glory that cost a kingdom its future, a silent, beautiful, and terrible monument to a sun that shone so brightly it left nothing but a magnificent, desolate twilight in its wake.